Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 14th, where we are talking about television, and we also will be talking about the final project. But first, a little bit about television. So you can see in the notes below that you've got some TV history, starting with the 1870s. That's when the cathode ray tube was invented, which allowed what we think of in terms of television, projecting an analog radio electronic signal onto a glass screen. But of course, our television today is much more technologically advanced than what would have appeared in the 1930s, which is when public demonstrations were being held to show this new invention. 1940s is when we've got commercial television, the idea of audio and visual broadcasts, black and white transmissions at that point, from a transmission point, a television station, to a reception point, which would be a television set. In those times, the television sets were rather large and bulky pieces of furniture, in effect, much like the old time radios were, and they were usually found in the center of the household, oftentimes serving as a kind of electronic hearth when you think about the flickering of the images. 1950s is the beginning of what we think of with the golden age of television, and there was a shift from live recording and single sponsor recording, which meant that an entire program would be beholden to satisfying that particular sponsor, to a pre-recorded program with multiple sponsors, which meant that program wasn't necessarily that dependent on one particular sponsor. It was also when satellites were in space for signal amplification. You might have heard of a show called I Love Lucy, and it was revolutionary for its day. And the reason why was because of its filming techniques. They utilized the techniques of film rather than television, so it was of much superior quality. And this was at the urging of Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball's husband, who basically was playing also the lead male role of Ricky Ricardo. And he was, by all accounts, a very savvy business person, understanding that what they had in effect was something that could live on in reruns and syndication, which is why even today in 2025, I Love Lucy has become an iconic standard. It also helped to establish the idea of the sitcom or the situation comedy, which is a very common form of television programming. So, 1960 was the first televised presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. Now, this is a historical debate that really changed politics. And one of the reasons why is because at this point in time, approximately half of the audience listened to that debate on the radio, while the other half watched the debate on television. And pollsters, depending on how much you can trust pollsters, came to a startling conclusion that the majority of individuals who listened to the debate on the radio, in other words, there were no visuals, had concluded that Richard Nixon won because of his superior presentation. However, the majority of individuals who listened and watched the debate on television argued that John F. Kennedy won that debate because of his superior presentation. And the difference between just audio and having visuals in addition to audio was huge. So there were lots of mistakes that were made, and probably one of the biggest ones is that Richard Nixon didn't wear makeup. He refused it, not understanding the way that Kennedy did the implications of being under those harsh lights and being filmed and not wearing makeup. So Kennedy certainly appeared to be more vibrant, and Kennedy, for better or for worse, is considered to be more physically attractive. And certainly, Kennedy knew about posture and dress in a way that Richard Nixon really didn't understand. It changed the way debates were done after that, that they really became visual presentations, and that's still the case for today. So, 1960s to 1980s, probably the heyday of commercial broadcast TV. Remember, we've talked about broadcast and that the idea is that large groups of individuals will ultimately receive that particular media. It's a farming term in terms of spreading out seeds. And it's hard for me to explain the kind of power that television had during this time. I was part of this time. I was born in 1967, so I grew up with television being the major media force at the time. Three networks, three channels that basically dominated the airwaves: ABC, NBC, CBS, all of them having their origins in radio. And the number of people that television could attract, in part because we didn't have the kinds of options that exist today. So ultimately, most people relied on television for entertainment and information. So you can see in the notes below that the 1969 moon landing, so that news broadcast, brought over 650 million worldwide viewers, to give you an idea of the magnitude of viewership. The programming of the time didn't necessarily bring those numbers, but still very respectable numbers. So if you are thinking about which evening program, which was known as prime time between the times of 8 and 11, which one brought the highest viewership, and that would be a series finale in 1983 of a television show called MASH that was supposed to be a comedy, but it also mixed elements of drama. So it was known more as a dramedy, and it was about the story of doctors in the Korean War. And I do remember quite clearly watching that particular episode. Was a little bit young to remember the 1969 moon landing. I was just a couple of years old, but I was in my teenage years in 1983 and did, like everybody else, it seemed like, watch that match series finale. Daytime TV, the distinction goes to a soap opera named General Hospital, where in 1981, two of the central characters, Luke and Laura, were married. This was a huge media event with over 30 million viewers, and it included at the time a film star who was also a General Hospital fan, and her name, Elizabeth Taylor, which you might have known of. And she was such a fan that she asked for a cameo on the show, so they actually gave her a cameo during Luke and Laura's wedding. And I remember watching that with seemingly everybody in 1981. And in fact, General Hospital was such a phenomenon, and Luke and Laura were such a phenomenon at that time. They were known as a super couple. That, for instance, colleges were not scheduling classes at the time that General Hospital would air. Keep in mind that we didn't have the technology that we've got today to record or stream. So basically, you had to watch at the time in which something was aired. And the reason why colleges weren't scheduling classes during the time that General Hospital aired is because they couldn't get enough enrollment because their students were watching General Hospital at home and in their dorm rooms. So, broadcast TV basically made its money from advertising and also syndication, leasing programs to local stations, which again is how we get something like I Love Lucy. It was a linear model and a communal popular cultural experience where basically everybody at the same time in the same place, usually it would be the living room, would consume these narratives so that we shared this kind of popular culture experience together, for better or for worse. And in some ways, it was better because it led to a sense of community. But in some ways, it was worse because the programming was meant to appeal to the largest audience segment. So the idea was that it wasn't in any way challenging or offensive or in any way would break the status quo. That's not to say that television didn't try to do that in the 1970s. There were groundbreaking shows. MASH was one of them, actually. You might have heard of All in the Family, and this was another one as well. Now, the cultural impact of television, again, I can tell you about it, but I have a brief video for you to see, and you can see this in the notes below under the first section. It's in bold. While it's a bit dated from 1995, it'll give you a good idea of some of the cultural history of television. It's 9 minutes long, so I'm going to ask you to watch that. And as I continue on talking about the history, the 1970s was known for miniseries where it was not just a program that would go through an entire television season, but it was more than just a standalone episode. So it would last for multiple weeks and tell a longer story. If you've ever heard of Roots, then you know that is perhaps one of the most famous miniseries of the 1970s. This is when cable networks also began to give competition to the what we call the broadcast networks, the big three: ABC, NBC, CBS. And cable networks had better transmission quality. So ironically, cable was first embraced by areas that couldn't get transmission signals. So oftentimes these were more rural areas. And cable allowed more diverse programming because it focused on narrowcasting, while broadcasting, being broad, focused on the largest possible audience. Narrowcasting focused on demographics, particular cultural groups that they could narrow their programming to. And the specialized programming allowed for a kind of storytelling that had never really been seen in broadcast TV. It was really more like the storytelling of film. Cable profits came also from advertising, but more importantly from subscriptions. And in the 1980s, not only did we have cable and pay-per-view, but a new broadcast network, which led to several. And the first was Fox, not Fox News, but the Fox network that aired hit shows like The Simpsons, which still is on. It happens to be the longest running television animated series, by the way. I don't think we're ever going to achieve the kind of numbers that television used to bring in. The Super Bowl does bring in large numbers, and perhaps a national tragedy might bring in large numbers. Though I can tell you right now, when I think about a national tragedy, take something like the attack on the Twin Towers, where I remember quite clearly how I had first heard about that. It was on the radio because I was in a business, and I ran as fast as I could to get to a television set to verify because I wanted visuals. So in today's world, in 2025, if I had first consumed the information on a radio, again, being in a business, my first response would be to go on my cell and to go on the internet. That gives you an idea of how much things have changed in the past 24, 25 years or so. So 1990s is where we've got video recording, and this has led to time shifting. So now you didn't necessarily have to all consume a particular product in a particular time period. And that changed the game entirely in terms of broadcasting. And there was also digital broadcasting, which allowed for higher quality and many more options. So 2000s, not only do we have nonlinear video on demand services, so in addition to VCRs and DVRs, we also have the advent of reality television, which started, in fact, because of, or actually its popularity. It's been around for quite a while, but the immense popularity of reality TV started because of a writer's strike, because it's a lot less expensive to produce and to show a reality television show than it would be for something that's scripted. In 2009, which is an important date for television, there was a shift from using radio analog signals, which is what was originally how we consumed radio, and that led to limited frequencies, some of the same problems that radio experienced, to digital. And digital is almost limitless, where you've got binary zeros and ones. Of course, this is the foundation of our computer communications. In 2010s, as we saw with just about all of the media vehicles, media convergence. So you've got computer, but also mobile device streaming. So not only is it nonlinear, not only can you consume it at any time, but also you can consume it from any place. And no longer were you beholden to a large television set in your living room, for instance. So chances are that you're consuming television in a much more personalized way, which is good because it can appeal to interests, but it's also bad because you're not having that sense of community gathering that we experienced in the 1980s, for instance, when we had something like a MASH finale that seemed to bring most of popular culture together, or at least it seems so. So, not only do we have media convergence, this is streamlined time shifting, this is place shifting, this is narrowcasting in a way that had never been seen before, much more streamlined. But programming is beginning to be produced by other media. So, no longer is it beholden to a network or a cable network, certainly not a broadcast network. Think about how Netflix has produced its own programming. And in 2020s, of course, we've got artificial intelligence and also the phenomenon of binging, which was really encouraged during the pandemic. And where the future of television is going, I'm not sure. When we talk about television, the early days of television, we were talking about the hardware, the actual television set. Now we're talking more about the software, so to speak, the programming. So you can consume that programming on a lot of different kinds of hardware, cell phone, for instance. And does that still make it television? Is, I suppose, one of the questions that we can ask, just like we started with asking, is a book just a physical entity, but can it be electronic as well? And is there a difference between the two? But I wanted to move on from television and talk, and again, please watch that 9-minute video about the cultural impact of television, and talk a little bit about the final project. And in fact, jump ahead a little bit. If you were to go to the bottom of our notes, and this is in the third section, you'll see our course outline, and we are coming to an end to the semester, believe it or not. Our next class on Tuesday, the 19th, we are talking about sound recording and popular music. On the 21st, we're talking about, which is a Thursday, we're talking about digital gaming. And our very last chapter is the following Tuesday on the 26th, where we're talking about media economics, which means that the class ends, so to speak, on the 28th Thursday, which is when your final project would be due, though certainly you can hand it in earlier. More on that in a moment. And it's when I will be posting the final examination. And if we were in a face-to-face class, you would be taking the final exam on the 28th. Obviously, this is not a face-to-face class. So I will post it on the 28th at the time our class would normally meet, which is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And you have 24 hours in which to submit in that final. So the final will be due on the 29th, which is a Friday at 1 p.m. And that does it basically for our semester. For the final, what I'm going to be doing is giving you a series of essay questions and giving you choice within those. And I'm certainly not expecting something as well written or polished as you might do in a final paper, because you've only got a few hours as opposed to a few weeks. Again, in a face-to-face situation, you would be spending approximately 2, perhaps 3 hours on the final exam, which is the amount of time I expect you to spend with the electronic version of the final. Even though you're given 24 hours, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours working on that final. And it's open book, open notes, so you can utilize things like our class discussions and our discussion forum responses and these class videos and our textbook. And it's basically about synthesizing elements with media. And as you could probably already tell, for many of the discussion forum responses I asked, it's less about factual actual question that's right or wrong, and it's more about an opinion question that results in your reasoning and how you're going to use facts in order to support a particular position. So, in terms of the final project, now you have some options. Most students end up doing a traditional academic paper, which is why I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper. But you don't necessarily have to do a formal academic paper. You could do something that is a little bit more creative, because after all, this is a media class, so you could utilize media in order to examine media. But I would definitely suggest that you start sooner rather than later. And in fact, that is today's attendance question. If you're curious, that our attendance question, which will be due Saturday on the 16th. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. What are you thinking about for pursuing for your final project, and why? And again, you're not necessarily committed. So if you put down an idea and you change your mind, it's certainly fine. But at this point in the semester, I want you to begin thinking about how and why of the final project. And in terms of writing, you'll note that this class had a prerequisite, which is Composition 1, English 101. So the assumption is that you've already taken an English class and you've already had some experience with writing papers. But that said, I've also included in our syllabus and other documents folder a handout that I distribute to all of my classes, not just my English classes, but also my media classes, about the conventions for writing. And it was actually a handout that was given to me in my college days to give you an idea of its age. And it's still one of the best that I have found in terms of reviewing the writing process. And it basically breaks up the writing process into 3 stages: planning, writing, and presentation. And in addition to that, you might be familiar with, and this is in the second section of the notes below, a website from Purdue University called Purdue OWL, which I highly recommend. It basically reviews the entire writing process from the very beginning, which is generating ideas, to the very ending, which is the submission of the work, and everything in between. And even though it's from Purdue University, it's public access. So they very kindly at Purdue made it available to everybody. So this is also a wonderful resource. And a third wonderful resource is our own GCC library. The library is quite aware that you will be writing papers in your classes. And the fact is that not everybody has access to the GCC library. As a student, you do. Your tuition dollars at work. And it reviews some of the conventions for writing, as well as recommends sites such as Purdue OWL. So the handout that I had referenced about writing the critical paper, and this is not in reference to writing a research paper where you're using outside sources, and you're certainly free to write a research paper for your final project, but it's a different kind of writing than if you're writing a critical paper where you're relying on your own thoughts and your own interpretations. Those are some of the things to consider when you're thinking about how you want to go about your final project. What kind of paper do you want to write? And the distinction between the two is whether or not you're going to be using outside resources. So certainly you can, but you're not necessarily required to. You can rely on what you've learned in this class and our textbook as well, depending on what it is that you're going to be doing for your particular project, which is why I'm asking in today's attendance question what it is that you're thinking about. And I always recommend that you make hard copies of all of the handouts, so to speak, that I upload onto our syllabus and other documents folder. So I suggest that you do that so that it's easy for you to reference. I've done that as well. And I wanted to just briefly talk about it today, and then I could review it in more depth next class. But if you're writing a critical paper, you're analyzing. So you're interpreting, you're not necessarily summarizing. So avoid the temptation to basically summarize what's in our textbook, for instance. Um, and begin with a strong thesis that is a main argument that reasonable people could disagree about. And you don't want to say something that's just too general that would apply to everything. That television explores the complexities of experience. Doesn't Isn't that true of all media forms? Or that books employ much imagery. Of course they do. Which book are you talking about? What imagery is referenced and why? Um, and when you're writing, you should have paragraphs, and each of those paragraphs should begin with what we call, or most of those paragraphs, I should say, should begin with what we call a topic sentence, which is the first sentence that summarizes what the paragraph is about. It gives a kind of direction to your essay. So, in theory, if you're reading something that's well written, not that everything is well written, or you're writing something, and hopefully that is well written, you can read the first sentences of your paragraphs and basically get an outline of what it is you're saying. And a paragraph is minimum 3 sentences. Remember, you're not writing for journalism. So if it's less than 3 sentences, it's not a paragraph from an academic perspective. And of course, the writing of academics is the writing that you use in the workplace as well. So that's how it transfers over. And if you're curious about the number 3, it's about a beginning, a middle, and an end. You always need a beginning, you always need a middle, you always need an end, but you probably will expand the midsection. And you need to support your points, perhaps with reference to the textbook or to personal experience, or if you're using outside resources, you would do that as well. Um, Quotations, certainly you're free to use them as evidence. Usually it's considered bad form to end a paragraph in a quote, because that usually is something, a quote is usually something that you talk about after you've used the particular quote. And your conclusion, which basically needs to be somewhat different from your introduction, which is where you give your thesis and you indicate what your position happens to be. Find an interesting way to conclude. Don't just recopy your introduction. Try to save an impressive observation for the end, or hint at a related idea, or apply your thesis to another work. And in terms of writing, and this is true of all writing, the first principle of good writing is economy. The second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. A very wise professor in college once said that a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. That you could continue to refine it and to develop it, but at some point you have to stop. So you try to do the best you can in the time in which you have. So I certainly encourage you to start working on this final project now, or definitely soon, because as we saw with the course outline, the semester is quickly coming to a close. And that said, what you should be able to do is to finish a piece of writing early enough so that you can put it aside and take a break from it, at least a few hours, ideally a few days, and then return to it with a fresh eye. And as you read each sentence, ask yourself, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words and not sacrifice meaning? And if the answer is yes, generally speaking, you should do that, because you'll end up with a much better paper. You want to vary your sentences. You want to have some short ones. You want to have some long ones. Too many long sentences, it sounds dense. Too many short ones, it sounds choppy. You also want to vary your sentence openings so that you don't have multiple sentences appearing one after another with the same opening. Again, a paragraph is a developed idea, so avoid the temptation to write 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs. Again, journalistic writing would be very, very different. The idea that adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, can be useful, but don't use them to pad the paper. If you're thinking about how long an academic paper should be, in this context, I'd say maybe approximately 4 to 5 pages for your final project. But as long or as short as it needs to be for you to bring forth a good argument. So I'm less concerned with length and more concerned with content. So when teachers talk about length, they're not talking about the number of words necessarily. They're talking about the number of ideas ideas. And that's something that sometimes writers get confused about, that they think that if they just add additional language that's not even necessary, whether it's repetitious or it's wordy, as long as they've hit the guidelines for the length, they're fine. And again, the length is about the number of ideas and arguments you have, not necessarily about the number of words. So I know going through your sentences and asking yourself, can I rephrase this in fewer words, can be a painful exercise, because now a 4-page paper is a 3-page paper, but a much better written paper at 3 pages than at 4 pages. Really, what you always had was a 3-page paper that just used a lot of unnecessary language that made it into a 4-page paper. So avoid cliches, overused expressions. Avoid slang, which is specialized language, informal language that is focused on a particular group, just because there's a greater possibility for misunderstanding with both. Imagine if English were not your first language and you heard some sort of a cliche or a tried expression, like, for instance, it's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? Why is it that cats go first? These are the questions that someone learning English as an adult might very seriously have. And again, it's just convention, but there really isn't a good explanation for it, though there might be some sort of historical reason as to why those expressions exist. And actually, a little piece of trivia, many cliches and trite expressions are original to Shakespeare. So we are actually quoting Shakespeare all the time and we don't even realize it. So if you've ever heard of something like jealousy is that green-eyed monster or dead as a doornail, that's Shakespeare. But when he wrote it, it was original. And the fact is that we've used it so many times that it no longer has originality. And again, if you think about slang, if again, imagine if English were your second language and you were trying to decipher, or perhaps even your fifth language, you were trying to decipher a sentence like, he's a cool person. On the surface, it sounds like you're talking about the person's temperature, not necessarily talking about their personality. And if you think, well, everybody knows this, not necessarily everybody. There's just a greater possibility for misunderstanding. So best to keep to what we consider standard English, that there's some sort of agreement about what should be universal. And I always tell a real life story in this context to indicate how easy it is to have misunderstanding. I try to tell humorous stories. This story is not humorous. And it is a true life story. And it happened several decades ago, where a second language student was going to a home for a party and he went to the wrong home, a home that had unfortunately been burglarized previously. So shall we say that the owner was rather jittery. When the student knocked on the door and the owner opened the door and the student asked, is this where the party is happening? The owner responded with a slang term, freeze, which means to stop. But for whatever reason, the student misheard or misunderstood. After all, freeze is how a liquid becomes a solid and under certain temperature conditions. But for whatever reason, the student took a step forward and the owner pulled out his gun, which he always carried, and shot that student dead on his doorstep. And it's one of the best examples that I can give about how significant misunderstandings can be. Sometimes they result in life or death, literally, which is why you want to try to use standardized writing and language in something like academic writing and in the workplace, just so that there is less of a possibility of misunderstanding. Of course, we speak very differently than we write. We text very differently than we might write, let's say, complete sentences in an academic paper. So it depends on the context and it depends on the audience. And at the very ending, the proofreading section, avoid mistakes in previous papers. Now, you didn't necessarily have a previous final project, but if you could get your final project in early enough, I can't necessarily give you a date. It depends on what my workload is like. But if you can hand it in early enough, I might be able to evaluate it. And if I can get it back to you before the ending of the semester, then you would have the option of rewriting it for a higher grade. And you should have a title for your project, and it should be something that's original. So you don't want to give it, let's say, the name of the textbook, because that's the name that's already been selected for our textbook. And To give you an idea of the age of this paper, or this handout, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Of course, your final project has to be typed unless it's utilizing some other media form. But if it's using some other media form, let's say like video or audio, it's probably accompanied with some explanatory text. Double space, provide a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists your contact information, name, date, due date, my name, the class, and the title. And the paper is due on the date assigned, and since your paper is due at the ending of the semester, that would be the last time at which you could submit in your paper. So that handout, as I indicated, was something that was distributed to me in an English class when I was an undergraduate student. But it still talks about many of the elements that all writers have to think about when they are writing a paper. And again, you can also access Purdue OWL, and you can also access the GCC library. So I'll continue this by talking a little bit about quotation and some of the conventions for quotations in an upcoming class. But for now, the assignment for you in your discussion forum is for you to talk a little bit about ideas, thoughts, or questions that you've got about the final project. And of course, you would be handing in a journal about television. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.